So this is my presentation on the primary sources related to Indian Americans throughout U.S. history. Let's get started. So the first source I chose was source number 8, which is two posters. This is the first part of it. Two posters that detailed the sale of Indian American lands by the U.S. government. The first one is just a basic public auction sale, specifies that it is specifically the lands are under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government, and the second one is basically the same idea, just goes a little bit into more detail on the specific amount of acres being sold per state and draws light to the extent of how much land was being sold. So the reason that the U.S. government was able to obtain so much Native American land was because of the Dawes Act in the late 1800s, which allowed the U.S. government to gain possession of the Indian tribe lands and split them up into individual allotments, and with the excess land that they had, they were just able to sell it, do whatever they pleased with it, and evidently it was just Native Americans being completely stripped of their land rights with no real reason or justification, as the U.S. government implemented that law themselves and enforced it for their own benefit. So this is very historically significant because it really marked the extent to which the U.S. government was willing to overlook the civilian rights of the Native Americans. They were not being seen as real citizens in the way that they were being treated with their property rights. They were not given the same property rights as citizens of the U.S. generally were given. Their land was stripped away from them, and they had no role in the process of it being sold. It was an advertisement poster created by white men to sell the lands to white men. There was no consideration of the true owners of the land. That was just not a thing. So, very historically significant there. The second part of source 8 is the occupation of Alcatraz. So we just have a poster, a photo of the front of the prison with a sign, and it says Indians Welcome. The name of the group here that occupied the island was Indians of Alcatraz, All Tribes. There's some guy sitting down there. So this was the occupation of Alcatraz by the IOAT, or the Indians of All Tribes group, was the longest occupation of a federal establishment, facility by any Indian Americans in history. It lasted 19 months. It was up to not quite 100 people, and 80 of those were UCLA Native American students participating in the protest. They were basically aiming to reclaim the island of Alcatraz under the treaty that was created many years earlier between the U.S. government and the Sioux people. Obviously, the treaty was not followed through with because Alcatraz was a prison, and does still remain a prison to this day. So this protest was very significant. Not only was it the longest Native American protest of any federal facility, but it drew a lot of national attention. Hollywood artists, Hollywood stars were publicly supporting the protests, and the people that were endorsing it, they were financially supporting it. The protesters were having people send them supplies on the island during their protests. And while the protest ultimately didn't amount to them reclaiming the land or anything very substantial, it did do a lot to draw national attention to the problem of Native Americans not getting their land, a historical inequity, as you can see in the previous slide. It was a very significant moment of Native Americans taking that step against the U.S. government in such a bold way as occupying the famous prison island. And it was a very important step. So the source number 3 is essentially a propaganda portrait. There's an Indian guy. His name was Tom Torlino Navajo. He initially was just a Native American person with long hair, as was sacred in their culture. He had the tribal clothing with the jewelry, the colorful fabrics, and after attending an Indian boarding school, his hair is all cut off and he's wearing a basic tuxedo, and just no sign of general Native American identity. So this specifically was the Carlisle Indian School, which was just one of hundreds of Indian boarding schools around the country that were intended to assimilate Native Americans to American culture. And their idea of doing this, as you can see, was chopping off the long hair and changing their attire. This was just the physical aspect, though. These schools did a lot more, indoctrination, teaching them Christianity, changing the way that they learned to better fit European ideals, all of that. These schools are very historically significant. This was a propaganda portrait by white people to perpetrate the idea that Native Americans needed that support of white people in order to become fully functioning human beings. Actually, the phrase that was most often used in these Indian boarding schools was "kill the Indian and save the man," which is interesting as it gives light to the idea that Indians were not real humans. They were creatures almost, or brutes or savages, as they were seen in the eyes of white people, of course. So Native American children at these schools were also separated from their families for up to years at a time. And obviously the purpose of this was to strip them of any sense of cultural identity or a sense of community that was given to them by their identities and their cultures, to ensure that they stayed in line and remained obedient to the white people ideals, basically. And just like the transfer of lands by the U.S. government, Native American people have not been respected through history. Their personhood and their right as a people to be respected for their culture and for their properties and for their very belongings, their right to life and freedom, all of these throughout history have been stomped on in many different ways. And yeah.